Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
This is KRWG Public Media, TV, radio, online, news that matters. Now, across the Mesilla Valley and the borderland, the stories that shape our community. From the KRWG Broadcast Center at New Mexico State University, this is Newsmakers.
Hello and welcome to Newsmakers. I'm Anthony Moreno. According to data from Northwestern University, residents in over half of U.S. counties have no or very limited access to reliable local news sources. It's no secret that the news industry has gone through big changes in recent decades. Here to discuss this issue more and how it has impacted our region is Diana Alba Soular, project manager with the Southern New Mexico Journalism Collaborative. Diana, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for the opportunity to be here.
Let's kick things off by learning a little bit more about the collaborative and just why it's needed in our time.
Sure. Well, the collaborative is a project of the New Mexico Local News Fund. The News Fund is a relatively young organization in New Mexico that's trying to find different ways to help sustain and improve local news throughout the state in a very challenging time for local news.
And you mentioned this being a challenging time in our region. We've seen a number of changes when it comes to just news organizations being available, local news outlets, newspapers, just coming off the top of my head. There's been a lot of reductions in staff in those areas. Can you kind of give us a brief history of just the challenges we've seen with that industry in the last decade or so?
Sure. It's a challenge that's been going on across the country, really, but it does feel more pronounced here in southern New Mexico, or in New Mexico sort of generally, but rural and southern New Mexico in particular. I think it's driven by several factors, but the basis of what's going on is that there have been a number of changes in how local news used to be funded and paid for. And it takes journalists, obviously, to produce local news and put effort into, verifying information, reporting information, presenting information, whether it's on digital broadcasts or print, or even other ways nowadays. And so without a way to pay journalists' salaries, then there's fewer journalists. And there's been several sort of big factors that have been going on the past couple decades. One obviously is the internet. During the advent of the internet, when information started being presented online, particularly by news organizations, they tended to present it for free, and people became accustomed to not paying anything to get the information that might have been on a TV broadcast or in a newspaper or maybe on a radio broadcast, getting that for free. So when news organizations reconfigure and like, oh, we need a way to pay for our producing our news, and they tried to put up paywalls or, these blocks that you can't see the article or you can't see the segment unless you pay. A lot of people weren't, in terms of audiences, weren't really willing to do that. And that's just one factor. So the advent of the internet was sort of the start of it, but there was several factors that sort of followed on the back of that. Social media sort of took that challenge that existed and amplified it, I believe, and that advertising revenue went so many directions. It used to mostly go to newspapers, TV stations, radio stations. Now it's going to like Meta and Facebook and the social media platforms. Even if people are paying for advertising at all, sometimes they just go directly to advertisers just go directly to their audiences through an email newsletter or like something like a Facebook page where they're not really paying that much to advertise.
Let's talk about how that really impacts journalism in the area at the local level when you have that ad revenue moving towards social media organizations or businesses or podcasting perhaps that may not have any journalistic value, but just offering a lot more opinion. How does that impact really understanding the information that we need to know on our daily basis?
Well, there's several major impacts, I would say. The first is that advertising revenue really used to sustain paying for journalists who that was their job, to go out there and report on issues of importance in communities. And when it's a journalist's job to be tracking, say, the school board or the county commission or the city council, there's just more eyes on what your local government is doing, what they're up to, whether that's positive or negative. Sometimes it's a little of both. And so without those advertising dollars, or sometimes it's been philanthropic dollars in the case of public media. When there's less of those available, there's fewer journalists, so that means there's fewer journalists to watchdog what's going on in communities.
And we've seen this in the last decade or so, just how that's been impacting what we know in regards to our local government. We've seen cases across the country where perhaps the city council has done things like give themselves a big raise, or other situations where we perhaps don't know or vet people running for office and just see how true their resume really is. Can you kind of share a little bit more about this, on just how that plays a role in our daily life?
Sure. Yeah, well, I think the more scrutiny there is of public entities in terms of what they're doing and how they're spending our tax dollars, the less chance there is for corruption or maybe mismanagement as well. And so there's definitely been some high-profile instances of candidates sort of slipping through the cracks who completely fabricated their resumes. I'm thinking of an instance of a city for instance, in near the Los Angeles area that the LA Times had really delved into. It was a small city, and they were completely flying under the radar in terms of scrutiny by media. Once they delved into it, they found a bunch of questions about how the public officials were running that tiny city. So, and then even closer to home, there's been instances of concern that really fly under the radar when somebody's not looking. I know more recently we've had questions about Memorial Medical Center, and the state attorney general is looking into those issues. It's positive that those concerns are being looked into, but there's also a likelihood they've been going on for some time, and possibly they would have been looked into earlier if we had more journalists able to examine these kinds of community concerns.
So what is the role of the collaborative and the New Mexico Local News Fund in trying to address these needs?
Well, the New Mexico Local News Fund is taking sort of a statewide look at potential solutions or ways to help local news. But one of the areas that we're attempting here as an organization in southern New Mexico is trying to bring together the remaining local news organizations, the remaining journalists whose jobs haven't been cut or eliminated in some way. And so trying to pull together remaining resources to look at an issue of concern in our community. During the pandemic, we were looking at issues of COVID recovery, and it's sort of taken sort of sub-focuses, I guess, into broadband reporting and also health equity kinds of issues. And so the idea is that there's really not, it's tough to collaborate on everything, but maybe there's a few things that we can collaborate on for the betterment of our community. And also another focus of the collaborative has been to look at potential solutions in our society, not just the problems that exist. And so looking at issues that could bring potential improvement to our community. What are other communities doing elsewhere that might be lessons learned for us, or what are people doing in our community that we just don't know about to try and solve some of these problems?
So shining light on things that may be working or helping alleviate a problem?
Yes, and with the idea that there's probably a lot we can learn from each other in terms of communities, or the basic premise of why we're doing this is because we sort of acknowledge that historically journalists have focused a lot on the problems in our communities without giving equal time to potential solutions to the problems in our communities. So it sort of turns audiences off, turns the public off when all you hear about is the problem over and over and over and over again. It gives this sense of hopelessness that there isn't really any ground that can be gained. Like, we might as well just throw up our hands and forget about it because there's nothing that can be done. We don't think that's a fair approach, like to ignore the solutions that people actually are trying to solve some of these issues.
And that also comes to addressing, I think, a point that has been brought forward in recent years with just how quick our news cycle moves and all the things that have been happening. Is just some folks have complained or just voiced concern about news fatigue when you're dealing with this. So, I mean, how as journalists moving forward, do you think we can address kind of that issue as well?
I certainly have heard people express concerns that amount to, they might not have used the term news fatigue, but I've heard them talk about that, where they're like, I'll see them post on social media sometimes, I don't even watch the news, or I don't read the news, and it's better for my mental health. And in some ways I can understand in that we didn't used to have a 24/7 news cycle. It was maybe news broadcasts or your daily newspaper or maybe your radio station if you were tuning in 5 minutes on the hour,
And those may have been locally owned.
Yeah, and they were probably more locally owned than they are now. But now, if you have your cell phone attuned to social media and you're following a number of news organizations and you have your TV turned on to a 24/7 news network, then you're probably going to be bombarded with news, most likely from a national scale, less so from the local organizations, but it can be easy to be overwhelmed, I think. So it's certainly a factor I think that journalists are going to have to consider. But I think one of the things that contributes to that sense of news fatigue is the fact that so much news just comes across as blatantly negative, regardless of if it's national, regional, local. It's a lot of times the worst stories that really catch people's attention. So I think that's where that issue I mentioned earlier of trying to pursue solutions reporting, I see it as more constructive than it's harder to throw it out the window and say, oh, that's negative, Mm-hmm. It's more of a constructive conversation, I believe, that involves news, but it's the conversation of, okay, we do have these problems, we're not trying to ignore that fact, but what's the next step? What are the next potential steps, And I think it opens the door for hope, which is, I think, an important just factor in the human psyche. And
well, it's certainly made an impact already in our community. I know KRWG Public Media has been able to be a part of that collaboration as well, dealing with solutions journalism. And with this collaboration and in past collaborations, something that's been able to really shine light not just on what's happening locally in our community, but as you mentioned earlier, other communities that may be addressing this, research that's out there as well into these issues. Sure. I know we were able to collaborate on a story dealing with COVID-19 recovery just on air filters. Yes. And you were able to discover what type of research was being out there as well. And that was something I think, can you share a little bit about that story? Sure. And just how it kind of shine light not only on the research, but also efforts of students in our area? Sure.
Yeah, well, during the pandemic, there was these couple of, I guess, researchers. One was like a company owner of an air filter company. They came up with this device called a Corsi-Rosenthal box. And basically all it is like four of a certain type of air filter, like a high quality air filter, and a box fan that sits on top of these 4 air filters. So it looks like a box with a a box fan of the kind you might plug into your house when it gets hot in the summer. And it pulls air through this box and like out the top, basically filtering the air in a room. And so they're in the course of researching like what can people do to help themselves. And this was coming about in COVID when people were very concerned about, and still are in many cases, the airborne transmission of COVID. And one of the ways that it can be transmitted is in these microscopic particles that we spew out when we breathe as humans. And so in a room when there's a lot of people in a room, or any room where there's people breathing, but the more people you have in a smaller room, the more chance of them breathing each other's air particles that they already breathed, and of course spreading COVID-19 or any other airborne virus that's out there. And so we found out about a middle school here in Las Cruces that had the students had taken it upon themselves, with the help of a parent and their teacher, of course, to build these Corsi Rosenthal boxes for classrooms in this small school. And so we were able to talk to those students. Johnny Coker here at KRWG interviewed those students, and I had found out about a larger school in Arizona, southern Arizona, that had done the same thing but on a much larger scale, and really turned it into a whole enterprise where it was like student learning, making the school's air cleaner and safer. And also there's like a university research project that centers around looking at, is this having a good impact on the school? So it was sort of exciting to see just that in some ways COVID-19 was such a big problem that it felt almost like too big for any one of us. Like what can I do? What can you do to take your health into your own hands? But these boxes really provided a way for anybody who has the money to buy the components of these boxes, which can be, around $100 or more, depending on which brands you buy and everything. So that is an expense for sure. But anybody who's able to invest in that expense and also build the fan can sort of clean their own air, like in their own house or their own classroom. So it was just sort of I thought, exciting story, because it was a solution to improving air quality, improving health, and the fact students were engaged and just so involved was cool as well.
And I think, you talked about students being engaged. I believe one of the parents we interviewed mentioned that this was not only something that could perhaps help make a cleaner environment for folks to breathe in, but also give students the opportunity to actually do something proactive during COVID-19 that could actually, help improve the air that they're breathing within their classroom. As we know, there's a lot of concerns with air quality nowadays, especially dealing with recent wildfires.
Certainly. Yeah, I think that was an exciting aspect too, is that probably of the people who felt the least empowered during the pandemic were kids who had very little control over what was happening around them, but this did provide a way for them to have at least some control. Of course, the boxes aren't going to guarantee that nobody gets COVID or anything, but it's just going to reduce the chances of viruses being spread within the classroom, from what researchers say.
I also want to talk about how local news can make a difference, not only in the public health sphere, what we're talking about, but also when disasters perhaps strike, when you have these emergency situations. We recently had 2 destructive wildfires that impacted the community of Ruidoso and surrounding communities as well. Can you share with us a little bit about how the lack of local news, perhaps in southern New Mexico, could make it challenging for information to get out during situations like that?
Sure. Well, there is one radio station in Ruidoso, and there's also it is a digital publication, Ruidoso News, and it recently transitioned ownership from Gannett, Gannett is the same company that owns the Las Cruces currently owns the Las Cruces Sun News. And it's one of the largest, if not the largest, newspaper corporation in the U.S. I haven't checked to see where it ranks on the scale.
It's certainly up there.
It's certainly up there. And so in Ruidoso, there were, up until Gannett had purchased the Ruidoso News, there were no journalists based in Ruidoso anymore. It was what could be considered a ghost newspaper. Just around the start of the summer, I think it was around June, there was a purchase of some New Mexico newspapers that was announced by a company, a smaller corporation that's based in New Mexico. It's called El Rito Media. And so that was in the middle of a transition. It's not quite clear. I just don't know the answer to this, whether they're going to base a journalist in Ruidoso, but it sort of shows like how when a crisis like that happens and you don't have a journalist or more than one journalist, ideally there'd be more than one on the ground, like how challenging it is to cover that. I think what we saw with Ruidoso is there were quite a few media organizations, news media organizations that came in from other parts of the state and also from El Paso that really bolstered the amount of information that was available. So that did help, I think. But ideally, you would have some journalists from within that community that's the hardest hit by it reporting on it.
I know you covered that story as well. We had some folks on our team covering it. But thank you for bringing up that point. El Paso Matters reported in July that the city's CBS affiliate would be eliminating most and perhaps all of its local newscasts. We still don't really know just how that's going to be impacting that station. And so can you kind of share with us your thoughts when you first heard this and kind of where we're going from here? Like, how alarming is it when you hear something like that?
Well, it's definitely very concerning to me, having been a journalist here for 20 plus years now, because even before this announcement, we pretty much existed in a local news desert, which is having too few journalists to serve the populations, the communities that are here. And so this means, I believe, I saw that same article that you referenced, that there's likely cuts to positions. That means journalists' jobs are going away. And in all likelihood, for the most part, whenever journalists' jobs disappear, they don't come back for the most part. That's just a trend that I've seen. Not to say that it's not possible, but it tends to not happen.
We still have a lot to learn on that, of course, and but there is some concern. I only have about 20 seconds left, but Can you share with us where folks can learn more about the Southern New Mexico Journalism Collaborative?
Sure. So we have a website, southnmnews.org is where we're trying to post stories, and also on Facebook as well. The parent organization of our group is the New Mexico Local News Fund, which also has its website. If you just Google New Mexico Local News Fund, it'll come up. But definitely, we're interested in hearing from people about this, what we believe is an important topic to our community.
Well, there's certainly a lot of stories that we'll be interested in covering as well as we move forward. Diana Alba Soular is project manager with the Southern New Mexico Journalism Collaborative. Diana, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Moving on, the American Library Association's Office for Intellectual Freedom reported that in 2023, the number of book titles targeted for censorship at public libraries increased by 92% over the previous year. One club in Las Cruces discusses banned books at their monthly meetings. Producer Christian Valle has more in this Community Connection.
Banned Book Club started at Thomas Brannigan Memorial Library when I was asked to highlight some of the resources of the New Mexico State Library. And in combing through those, I noticed that they had a banned books library through the Digital Public Library of America. And so the mission of that organization is to provide banned books to communities where, for whatever reason, their access is being restricted. So I thought, this is wonderful. I'm going to be able to ensure that patrons here in Las Cruces have access to this digital library. And so I loved the name Banned Books Club. And so I thought, why don't we make that a reality? Why don't we have that here in Las Cruces? And so, yeah, we have a club and it meets here physically at the library as well as online. It's important because it's a First Amendment right. We have access to books and freedom of information, and when that's restricted, ideas are restricted, narratives are restricted. The books reflect the lives of diverse individuals, and we want to see individuals have access to stories that are meaningful to them and that affirm them. And so if that's being challenged or restricted, they don't have, the potential for self-development is lessened. And it's really important that that doesn't happen to children. Books are banned or challenged for various reasons. It could be that somebody deems the material to be unsuitable on the basis of it's inappropriate for a certain age. The content might be something that they disagree with or dislike, and so patrons do have the right to petition to have materials at a public library be reviewed and possibly removed or placed in a different location. The Banned Book Club meets the last Thursday of the month, 12:30 here in the library, and you can get a link to our virtual discussion. The books become available on the first of the month, so you can come to the reference desk and check out a physical book, and they're always available online. You can go to library.las-cruces.org. You will see links to our Hoopla app and our Libby app, and those are accessible through download on your phone, on a tablet, or on a PC. And all you need is download that, and you can log in with your library card and PIN, and you have digital access at home or wherever you go. Those stories that are restricted, those stories that are unorthodox, those ideas that people tell you shouldn't read or you should be afraid of, or they want to use to divide you or to diminish you in some way, come read them. And they're going to keep banning books, and we'll keep affirming them. We'll keep reading them and joining together as a group.
That's it for this week's program. Remember, you can always stay updated with news anytime at krwg.org. I'm Anthony Moreno. We'll see you next time on Newsmakers.